All right. So tonight we're reading this paper called A Plea for Indigenous Economics, the West African Example. You know, in recent weeks, there's been this conversation about culture and how culture is an offshoot of economics. You can find that conversation on the pro-Black perspective. The issue that we have is that we don't have our own economic system. And so we need to work on an economic system that suits our people and our people's situation. And so in reading this paper tonight, the hope is that we actually uncover some thoughts, some ideas towards creating this indigenous economics that will help in our liberation. So I want you guys to stay tuned. On the opposite side of this intro, we'll get to reading this paper. Before that, though, in the chat room, I see we have some folks who are here taking the show. We have Kevin Carre 42. We've got NYC Sports Archives. NYC Beauties is here saying hello room. And of course, we have the Learning Curve with the Revolutionary Matron here as well. She just finished doing her show just a little while ago, and I'm sure she's going to be doing her late night show. Well, so you guys make sure to tune in to the Learning Curve with the Revolutionary Matron. All right? We'll be back on the other side to start this reading.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio. Welcome to the Bitter Medicine Podcast, where it's all about Black empowerment. Our show focuses on Black news and entertainment, arts, science, economics, history, people, and strategies that uplift, empower, and motivate Africans within the diaspora. And now, your host, whose favorite color is black, Goku.
Yes, indeed. This is the Bitter Medicine Podcast. I am your host, Goku. Before we get into the paper, just want to remind you guys that this show is part of a podcast network called KWAZ Radio. There are other shows on the network you are being invited to tune into as well.
This is D Webb with the Harsh Reality Podcast, asking you to tune in where we tackle the news of the day that affects our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-Black perspective, where Black problems are addressed with Black solutions.
Greetings, fam. Tune in to The Learning Curve with me, the Revolutionary Matron, on KWAZ Radio.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Yes, indeed. You guys make sure to tune in to those other shows. Make sure to subscribe to those shows' YouTube channels. Click the bell to be notified when they have new content coming up. I know the Pro-Black Perspective is going to have a show coming up with the Revolutionary Matron and Chaka, and I'm a bookman. So you guys should definitely go over, tune into their YouTube channel. Make sure to click the bell to be notified when they're on again. I'm sure the Harsh Reality Podcast will be dropping something new. I think they're going to be doing their first live stream soon. So you want to make sure to subscribe to those channels. And of course, Revolutionary Matron is on every night at midnight, as well as at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, doing her show as well. Sometimes you'll see me or the Harsh Reality Podcast, or sometimes even the Pro-Black Perspective will pass through and check out her show as well. Now, with that said, all the business out the way, the Tito District is here saying peace. Peace to Tito District. Thanks for coming through. Appreciate you. You guys make sure to hit the like button. YouTube does some weird stuff with our streams, like they seem to be doing right now as well. So make sure to hit the like button as well. Okay. So let's get to it. Let's get to this reading. Let's get to this reading. Let's see what we can learn from this paper tonight. PLEA for Indigenous Economics, the West African Example by Paulie Hill, the University of Michigan. This article is concerned with the need in underdeveloped regions such as West Africa pursue a subject which, for want of a better term, I call quote-unquote indigenous economics, or the study of indigenous economies. I shall start by outlining the general nature of the subject and by discussing the reasons for its neglect, both during the colonial period and today. Although the whole of my discussion relates to West Africa, it has some relevance to certain other newly developing tropical regions. Indigenous economics is concerned with the basic fabric of existent economic life, such economic activities as production of export or other cash crops, subsistence farming, cattle raising, fishing for cash subsistence, internal trading in foodstuffs, transportation, economically motivated migration, like to cities, industries, and farms, indigenous credit granting systems, and so forth. Far from being identified with either pre-monetary or subsistence economics, our subject is more concerned with quote-unquote cash activities, not because of their greater importance, for here there is much variation, but for the practical reason that the cash sector is easier to study. Nor are we particularly interested in the old-fashioned evolutionary ideas which would identify quote-unquote progress with a shift from subsistence to cash agriculture. For we know that most West African farmers produce both for subsistence, right, our own consumption, and for cash, and that an increase in the one type of activity may actually enhance a growth in the other. It is the structure of the relationship between the two types of activity which is interesting and important. So there you have the setup for the kind of work that we're going to encounter in tonight's paper. By the way, I didn't do a show on Tuesday. I thought I was going to be able to do a late live stream at 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, but my teaching assignment ran way over. And so I didn't do a show on Tuesday. My apologies. We will continue with reading Nation Building by Akoto. We will continue doing that this coming Tuesday. It'll be a pre-recorded show. The live premiere at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Tuesday. I'll try to be in the chat room as much as I can during that time. So forgive me for missing last Tuesday, but look forward to a new episode this Tuesday coming. You guys can hear me in the chat. Type 1. You can hear me in the chat just so I know for sure that my words are being transmitted. Because I see some folly going on with YouTube. Okay. Let's continue. By the way, this is a short paper tonight, which is good for me because I'm a bit tired anyway, but this is a short paper. So let's see if we could get some good foundation out of this paper to continue. If the scope of indigenous economics is so wide, what then distinguishes it from conventional economics? As I hope that the general nature of this discussion will emerge from the latter discussion, I make only a few preliminary points. Firstly, although it is true that the indigenous economist stands in some ways opposed to the quote-unquote development economist, he is much interested in processes of change and modernization. He does tend to regard these processes from a non-governmental standpoint. Secondly, the distinction between the two types of economics is not hard and fast, but is mainly a matter of approach. While an indigenous economist might find himself very interested in problems of recruiting labor for a new factory, it could happen that he was unconcerned with whether that factor produced textiles or cement. Thirdly, the indigenous economist tends to take the broad lines of government economic policy for granted, in that he is not concerned with their formulation, though he may indeed hold strong views on the effects of introducing new measures. Fourthly, the indigenous economist holds that while his subject is similar in a general way to conventional or Western economics, factors which require emphasis in any situation may be unexpected, so that those who guess on the basis of Western experience are apt to go wrong, even on fundamentals. He insists that the economic behavior of individual West Africans is basically quote-unquote rational and responsive, but that the structure of this rationality requires studying in the field. Right? In other words, you can't apply the West, concepts of the West to these concepts that you're trying to reestablish and enforce in the continent, particularly in this paper using the example of West Africa. So you guys can hear me in the chat. Thank you for responding. I appreciate that. Right. Study of indigenous economics was neglected during the colonial period and is contemptuously regarded by nearly all economists today. Those same intellectual, political, and emotional processes associated with the collapse of colonialism, which provided African historians with such glorious new opportunities, hardened the arteries of economists in relation to indigenous studies. The new history is seldom economic history. Traditionally, during the brief colonial period, economists were concerned with the point of contact between West African and European economies, with the economic relationship between the metropolitan country and the colony. This led them to concentrate nearly all their attention on external trade, on the acts of exportation and importation as such, rather than on export crop production or indigenous systems of internal distribution. Faced with the question of how export production was organized, by whom, on what sort of scale, under what conditions of land tenure, with what capital and labor, etc., economists were usually obliged to guess. Quite often, as present evidence is beginning to show, they happen to guess wrong, and a formidable body of quote-unquote economic folklore, which took strength from its reiteration in books and official publications, established itself during half a century. One of the incidental concerns of the indigenous economists is the destruction of these economic myths, both by means of providing an alternative analysis and by the mere process of calling them into question. Even though he so often lacks the material which would enable him to set up a solid structure in place of any myth, he is encouraged to note that, as his work proceeds, he begins to be able to make judgments, certain contexts, of the kinds of economic happenings which are likely to make good sense, so that he may be quite an effective critic. So essentially here, what we're seeing is, and it's just common sense, right? Economics under colonialism was in the interest of the colonizer, where the colonizer has a relationship with the colony, one of extracting resources to the benefit of the colonizer's home country, right? They don't extract coltan from the soil in the Congo to enrich the folks who are from the Congo. They extract those minerals from the dirt there to enrich the home countries, right? France and whoever else, right? To turn profits for France, right? And so forth and so on. And so when that happens, obviously the colonizer isn't going to be concerned with what economics could look like if you were in control of your economics. All that really happens there is that people talked about certain ideas that could be feasible, right? And even then, the ideas are still against the backdrop of the colonizers' work, the colonizers' economic work, right, in that area. So it amounts to nothing more than really like a myth, right? You're not really looking at what you can do in-house. All you're looking at is the economics around exporting these resource extractions from your colony, right? So hopefully in this paper, we'll look a little bit closer at what it is that once you remove the colonizer, what it is that the people there on the continent can do in-house amongst themselves with their own people when it comes to economics. Right? Continue. In assisting on the narrow scope of conventional economics in regions such as West Africa, I am not exaggerating. We are all far more ignorant than we are knowledgeable. From Dakar to Cameroon, there is very little systematized knowledge relating to the economic organization of internal trade in West African foodstuffs and raw materials. There is scarcely any literature on this subject fit to be thrust into the hands of the visiting experts. So if you happen to be wondering, how come folks, say in West Africa, haven't done their research into methods or ways to organize economics on their own internally, is because once again we see where economics plays a part in colonization, right? The economics that you would learn under the colonizer is economics that benefits the colonizer. So when folks say that the culture is the culture of the colonizer, of course it is. When folks say that tertiary education just reflects the colonizer's culture, well, of course it does. They're not going to teach you how to organize for your own self-determination. They're not going to teach you how to organize for your own self-determination. Right? I listen to the Matron After Dark show pretty much every night. And Kevin Carre 42, who's in the chat room, who said, "Greetings, family, ready for the great education." He says something all the time. He says, it's time for black folks to separate themselves from these folks, talking about Muzungu, right? Separate from these folks and do your own thing. You're intelligent, you're creative, you're capable. So it's time to sit down and look at your unique situations where you are. And I think that's something, too, in listening to the Matron After Dark that has become completely recognizable, is that we're outside of the continent speaking on behalf of what the continent needs to do not being fully immersed in the day-to-day life of continental Africans. What we think it is, what we see it as, is not reflective completely of what it is for them day in and day out. Like we heard during the Solution Summit, there was this brother on the continent who said, listen, well, what's really going on the continent is people want money, man. People want money, and to get that money, they'll scam you. They'll scam their families, right? If you miss and have some property and you ask them to look after it, they'll sell it because what they want is money. Not that what they want is food. Of course, the money would be used along those lines, of course, but there's not this urgency of saying, hey, let's develop our agriculture, let's develop our internal trade. They want cash. Get the money, dollar bill, y'all, right? That's what they want. And so we got to start understanding these things a little bit more too. We got to start connecting with the everyday continental who's on the continent, right? And helping them understand and them helping us understand what's necessary, what's needed in the immediate, right? If you want to talk about developing economics or economies on the continent, you got to understand what folks need in the immediate, right? Whereas I would talk about in the past, I would say, well, they need to be able to feed themselves, so they need to work on their farming and internal trade. As it stands, folks on the continent don't see it that way necessarily, right? They kind of see it in a roundabout way, but they don't see it in the direct way that we see it. They want to get to the money part, right? We got to get to the understanding of the culture and build around the everyday struggle. The Tito District says that's why building bridges between the folks on the continent and diaspora, there can be a short-sightedness about money and land. Absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, after these conversations with the matron, where the matron has been connecting with folks on the continent, a lot of what we hear and what we talk about in Pan-African spaces needs to be completely rethought a little bit. Needs to be updated at least to reflect what's really happening out there, right? But we got to arm ourselves with some information as well, and so hopefully this paper will shed some light on some of the things that we need to think about in the immediate. Right? Of course, some anthropologists have ventured into economic fields, but they have seldom been concerned with the kinds of generalization which typify economists. Their example is of profound importance to the indigenous economists. But they have not done this field work for him. Again, the education that our continental brethren have gotten has been an education to this day still that benefits the colonizer. Remember, colonization didn't end because the education that the folks had on the continent were made for a continuation of doing things the way the colonizers did them, right? And not thinking on your own. If you remember, some time ago I talked about this. I have a friend. She works with someone on the continent. They're building this business hub. And they're trying to penetrate different industries in Ghana. And one of the complaints I hear over and over is that the Ghanaians, not to pick on any one group, but Ghanaians are not educated to kind of think on their own. Right? Again, according to these folks who are trying to establish a business hub over there. And so it makes it particularly difficult to communicate with a lot of Ghanaians, especially the educated ones, because they're not thinking You know, the way we look at and approach problems and problem solving, they don't see it that way. You got to kind of spoon feed them through the process. You know, so we got to really start understanding what's going on the continent. Bottom line is continental Africans, much like us out here too, by the way. But there's a difference out here in the West. There's something that's a little bit different out here in the West that we have to be honest about. Where we can still kind of put up a fight, we can still kind of think, we can still be critical, etc. Whereas on the continent, a lot of the folks kind of just follow the script. Tito District says there can be a tendency to just follow the process of the West uncritically. And I agree with that 100%. I think, you know, we were duped, and this is true in the Caribbean, this is true in America, we were duped into thinking that, well, if the colonizers were able to be successful doing it this way, we must be able to be successful doing it a similar way, now just with black faces, with our own people, right, implementing and carrying out the work. But that's not the case. What we should have done during the independence runs in the 60s and 70s was really before, as we were pushing for independence, we should have been thinking about how to do it our own indigenous ways. What we really signed up for as African people is to be sunned by, is to be a part of this paternalism, right? Where we still had to hold the hands of our oppressor. We still had to suck on the teat of our oppressor. We didn't take time. And, you know, some people might say, well, we shouldn't have rushed into independence. I don't know if that was would have been a good idea either to slow walk our way. I just think our leaders, our talented ones who were upheld by the indigenous people, I just think they kind of were a little bit lazy in their approach and just decided to go about things pretty much the way things were done before. With few exceptions, right? With few exceptions on the continent in particular, in the Caribbean in particular. Right? In America, frankly, the population of Africans here within this white nation just kind of went along with what it was. It's not their nation here. So they had to go along with it. I saw this brother on Twitter, Exports to Mark, said something real interesting the other day. You know, what he said is not really interesting, but how poignant he was about it was. I talk about all the time here about white mommy, white daddy. And he said, you know, if you peep it really and truly, black folks in America think that they fight, that they do all this fighting against white supremacy, but really all you're doing is complaining about white supremacy. You're not really fighting against it. And that he went on to say that the reality of it is black Americans, and when I say black Americans too, I'm talking about Caribbeans who come here, continental Africans who come here, who become quote unquote Americans, and that, you know, by being here, all of us, you know, as Exports to Mark said, we all are out here, you know, we get our news from this white boy. We get our streets cleaned because of this white boy. We get our medicines from this white boy. So we are, you know, as black folks, as Africans, we are the most dependent Africans there are on the face of the earth. You know, we could change that though. You know, That's what Garvey was trying to do with Pan-Africanism. And there's a paper I want to read, although I don't think it has as much depth to it as I'd like it to have, but it talks about the economics of Garveyism. Again, I don't think it has as much depth to it as I'd like it to have. I think it kind of is like a summary of the history of Garvey and Garvey in terms of the different businesses and stuff that he created. But the thing that Garvey was trying to create in Pan-Africanism was an economy, right? A Pan-African economics where you buy black, right? You sell black, you make money with black folks throughout the diaspora. And that's something that we still need to think about. But we gotta go to the heartland of it, which is the continent, and improve the indigenous economics there. Once we solidify that, everything else will follow and should fall into place a little bit more easily. Tito District says he has an amazing Twitter page, Great House. I learned so much from him. Absolutely. Great House drops a lot of knowledge. He seems a little bit reclusive, but he drops a lot of knowledge, and I appreciate that from that brother. To continue, most British, unlike American economists, are wholly ignorant of agricultural economics, which they regard as a separate discipline, right? So now we're starting to talk about the real deal. The findings of those few agricultural economists who have worked in the field in Nigeria and Ghana, for instance, have had little influence. Besides, agricultural economists have, quote, neglected traditional agriculture, leaving it to anthropologists who have made some useful studies, end of quote. Present-day economists are far more ignorant of the rural economies of certain poor regions, including West Africa, than were their 19th century counterparts of the rural economies of Europe. There has been a retrogression of knowledge. While agriculture is the oldest production activity of a settled community, surprisingly little is known about the incentives to save and invest where farmers are bound by traditional agriculture. Oddly enough, economics has retrogressed in analyzing the savings, investment, and production behavior of farmers in poor countries. The older economists had a better conception than economists now have of the particular type of economic equilibrium relevant under these circumstances. Growth economists have been producing an abundant crop of macro models that are, with few exceptions, neither relevant in theorizing about the growth potentials of agriculture, nor useful in examining the empirical behavior of agriculture as a source of growth. So earlier I talked about the fact that Africans on the ground, on the continent, as one brother pointed out to us during the Solution Summit, you guys should go back and check out on the Learning Curve podcast YouTube channel. One thing that the guy, the brother said was Africans on the continent, he basically said, F all that stuff y'all talking about. Africans on the continent are thinking about money. And so this is where all the scamming and all this type of stuff comes up. And that happens because, sad to say, that happens because your colonizer, formerly and presently, your colonizer is not teaching you about indigenous economics. You feel me? Your colonizer is teaching you about the colonizer's economics. And the colonizer's economics is capitalism all day. So there's this money consciousness, to use Revolutionary Matron's term that she uses frequently. There's this money consciousness that's on the continent, as opposed to what are the building blocks right, to produce commerce, right, and to produce a fair and equitable commerce on the continent that will see the majority, if not all, but the majority of its people taken care of. And there isn't that consciousness on the continent. So this is why folks every day are just worried about money, and they'll do whatever it takes to get that bread, right? Agricultural economists are themselves occasionally very frank about their ignorance. We hear a lot about this gap between the scientific agriculturalist and the native peasant farmer in the tropics. But I don't think there is a gap. You see, neither of them knows how to improve agriculture. What do we really know about the effect of the organic matter as compared with the minerals in the dung of cattle on particular savanna soils in Africa? What do we know about the probable results of attempts to integrate livestock and crop production to get more modern farming systems, not only in savanna Africa, but in very many other areas? You know, the last time I saw Tito District on the show, we were having a conversation about what were the important cash crops in these continental countries. What were the countries organized by resource rich, resource scarce, etc.? Where's our database with this information? I mentioned Amilcar Cabral. In Guinea-Bissau, he was out there testing the soil, testing for soil erosion, soil composition, testing what soils and what times of the year were best for their staple crops, etc. And that work, the colonizer is not going to teach you to do that work unless it's in service of the colonizer. So the colonizer traditionally has extracted palm oil and stuff like that. So yeah, they'll teach you when's the best time to harvest that palm oil crop and whatever other crop it is that they want back in their home country. But they're not going to teach you it, and they're definitely not even going to hint to you that what you're learning for their extraction of resources you can ever use internally within your people specifically, and within your people generally, meaning within your people within your region of the continent, if not continentally, period. Right? And so you got to pay attention to this stuff, folks. We aren't going to win this battle unless we start to get real scientific about what's going on around us, until we get real business minded about what's going on around us, until we organize and identify our enemies. We won't win anything. We won't progress to anywhere. Right? And so it's conversations like these, it's thinking like this that you want to have. If you want to talk about going back to the continent and falling in line with what's going on the continent, you out here, you need to start equipping yourself with the skills. Right? So if we're talking about agricultural economics and agricultural economies, then a smart thing to do, and I have a whole episode where I talked about this some time ago, smart thing to do would be to start understanding the skills, to start acquiring the skills, right? That could provide help on the continent. You know, when I talked about, some people probably thought I was crazy when I talked about photosynthesis. I talked about if you understand photosynthesis, right? You understand it from a child, and you grow up with that understanding and build upon that basic knowledge. How you too, or how we all as well, can come to the point where we're manipulating photosynthesis to increase biomass of crop production. so that we improve upon the harvesting methods of a staple crop like rice, for example, yams, and palm oil, and all the things that you would need to feed the people on the continent, right? If we're not doing that, we're in trouble. And frankly, if we're out here in the West, particularly in the US, where we have proximity to what these folks do. Like, for example, I pay attention to pig farming in America. Why do I do that? Because I grew up with my grandmother and my uncle being pig farmers. And some of the things that I saw that we did home with pigs growing up in a bunch of slop and all that kind of stuff, I look at America and I study it. Not just America, but I even look at, sometimes I get to see what's going on like in Europe and stuff like that. And these guys aren't growing pigs in a bunch of slop. I'm always surprised that we built these pig pens out of concrete and cinder blocks. And these guys, I notice, have these pig pens that are just basically chicken wire. And they let these pigs roam during the daytime. And they herd them in the evening. And I noticed that what they feed them, where we were feeding them, quite frankly, we were feeding them scraps, from the hotels and stuff like that. Essentially garbage, rotting food and all that kind of stuff. I look at what they do out here. They feed them, they grow sweet potato and yam and stuff, right? Real starchy type foods, right? And they grow that, and that's what they feed to these pigs and stuff like that. So if you're gonna be around these folks, you're gonna be this population within their nation, and you have this proximity. Just like how I talk about the old shoe shine guys, just to air hustle and go and invest based on what they heard these white boys talking about while they were cleaning their shoes. You're going to be around these folks, pick up some of the game that they have and take it back, right? Pick up some of the game and take it back. You don't have to have the $1 million backhoe, or not $1 million, but the 6-figure backhoe to do your work. When the time comes and you've raised the capital, then you could invest in that kind of thing. But in the meantime, you could put in that hard labor, right? Look at what these folks do, and you could take those techniques back and start to improve upon, what it is. You could invest in education. Send your kids to get that knowledge, right? Until you have your own secondary and tertiary institutions of learning. Send them to get that knowledge. I'll give you another example. Back in the 90s when I came here, a lot of Trinidadian kids were coming to college and majoring in some boring shit like geology. And I would ask, like, why are you majoring in geology? Forgetting, and then being schooled on it, that they have oil in Trinidad. They have natural gas and oil. They come out here and they learn that stuff so they could go back to their country and get working in the oil sector, the natural gas sector. If you're going to be around these folks, soak up the game, take it back with whatever little you can, right? Because they're not going to teach you how to apply it. But if you understand the methodology and you go back with the mindset, the scientific mindset, the business mindset, the organizing mindset, you can go back and do that work that someone like Amilcar Cabral did. Study the environment and adapt those methods that you learned and adapt it to what's going on the ground in the continent. Revolutionary Matron says, The term I heard was permaculture farming, I think. Right? So permaculture is this approach in agriculture that focuses on whole systems, right? Like whole systems thinking, right? And they study like patterns in nature and they apply it to agriculture, right? That's what you got to be doing. If you're not studying the nature of where you're trying to build, if you're not then taking the tools, the methods that you learn, secondary and tertiary education, and applying it or adapting it to where you're trying to do the work, then you're wasting time. KW Dawn 7 says, we do not control our own water. And by default, the urine that comes from that same water. We do not control our own water. And by default, the urine that comes from that same water. Revolutionary Matron says, facts. That's a problem that we're going to have to address because this white boy is setting himself up to completely privatize, to completely own fresh water. While we're out here bullshitting, we need to be protecting the land, protecting the sea, in particular, fresh water. If we don't do that, we're done. If we have to get to the point we have to ask permission for clean water, that we have to pay for clean water, we're done. So I actually agree with KW Dawn 7. By the way, I appreciate all of you who are out here tonight with me, taking in this reading. I hope you guys are thinking about how you can do it, put in some work out here where you are because you have some proximity to techniques and methodologies, right? I hope you're also trying to connect with someone on the ground in the continent to be able to be a conduit for this knowledge, to be able to transfer these ideas. Remember when we talked about the African brother who built a windmill? Sorry. You got that Rona cough. No, I'm kidding. But remember when we talked about the kid who built those windmills in Africa? Remember, he studied from a book at the time, an old book, right? That kid was named William Kamkwamba, I think is his name. William Kamkwamba. He studied from a book that he found in his local library, an old book. And he took that knowledge and he built these windmills, right, out of this old bicycle and a dynamo, right? As the wheel of the bicycle turns, it turns this dynamo. This dynamo, the turning of the dynamo creates an electrical current. And he was able to provide light and actually water for his hometown, which suffered from drought. He was able to connect this to a water pump, throw this water pump down in a well, and was able to actually draw up water, right? Irrigate the crops, etc., etc. And also, when word of it got out on the internet, this happened maybe 12, 13, 14 years ago, maybe even 15 years ago now. When this came out on the internet, he was scooped up by a school out here in the States I can't remember if it was Winston-Salem or something like that, but he was scooped up by a school out here, right, to study. You see what I'm saying? And if you're not careful, that's how you're going to lose your people too, right? The matron says water is already traded as a commodity. Yeah, I think it's on, like, in Chicago and certain parts of the states, it's traded as a commodity. You know? So we got to start really, really understanding, you know, the components that we need to really do the work that we got to do. If you're going to be in America, make it a good time. Make it a good one. Get those skills. Get that knowledge base. Right? And by the way, that book that William learned from on how to make electricity, how to build these turbines, because that's what the book was about, building a turbine. And he basically built a stripped down version using a bike. Old bicycle, his father's bicycle. In fact, it wasn't an old bicycle, it was his father's bicycle that his father actively was using to travel around with to get to and from work. That book, which probably cost, let's say, $30-40 as a textbook, when it was in stock, Amazon, someone had that on Amazon for $300-400. Right? $300-400. Right? So it tells you that there's something to it. And if you want to be able to use that knowledge, you're going to have to come up, if you're on the continent, you're going to have to come up with those $300-400 that you can't come up with. I bet you they pulled that book off shelves, off library shelves on the continent too. You see. Yeah, did they price it up that way to make money? Absolutely. But they also price it up that way, put that knowledge behind a paywall so it's not readily accessible. Because clearly it has some explanations or what have you, some ease of understanding in that book. That if you start getting a bunch of Africans across the continent combating drought in their regions and being able to provide lighting in their villages and irrigate their crops, guess who won't like that? Feel me? Use your time and use your proximity wisely. A great deal of trouble is caused for us and for the natural scientists themselves because individually and in subject groups, they assume that their pet ideas and results are more fully finished and marketable than in fact they are. They therefore proclaim that much of their knowledge lies unused. When West African governments announced that the time is ripe for the introduction of large-scale mechanization programs in agriculture, agricultural scientists lack either the courage or inclination to raise their voices protesting their ignorance of the consequences, but rather offer their services, usually through international specialized agencies, as technical experts. When West African politicians deplore, as they so often do, the backwardness of farm people, they are unaware of the extent to which they are echoing the conventional ignorance of economists. In West Africa nowadays, the educated urban classes, notably the politicians, increasingly refer to farmers as peasants. It's condescending and misleading. And I'm going to continue. I'm going to continue in a second. I always have had a problem when I do a reading and I read the term peasants. That's a European thing to do. I never liked it myself. And so I hope that in this reading, folks wake up from that nonsense as well, to continue. Increasingly refer to farmers as peasants. This is condescending and misleading, for the word peasant denotes, among other things, a degree of rusticity, in comparison with his betters, which we do not feel justified in attributing to the African villager. African villagers do not seem to feel the same degree of ambivalence toward the political superstructure that European, Asian, and Latin American peasants do. They do not, to the same extent, feel judged from above by a set of standards which they cannot attain. The Beatrice Webb tradition of qualitative field observation and experiment has been out of fashion for some half a century. So there's no wonder that field inquiries were neglected in the colonies. All right? But even had this spirit of scientific inquiry not fallen into desuetude, it is likely that conventional British assumptions about West African economic behavior would have inhibited field investigation. Typical implicit assumptions were, now this should be good, pay attention. A, that it was the expatriate trader, right, like one who trades, who taught the West African, if only by example, the elementary facts of economic life. It followed that the economic response of indigenes was essentially Western and familiar and required no study. If it was not familiar, it was not economics. B, that the basic fabric of economic life was so simple as to be devoid of interest to economists, only by assuming that indigenous economics and Western economics were identical did the former become worthy of study. But then assumption A came to the rescue. C, that given the complexities associated with tribalism, local land tenure, kinship, and inheritance, communal work system, and so forth, indigenous economics operate on too small a scale, or on too local a basis, to be of interest to economists, and are anyway incomprehensible. Not until social and political systems have been modernized will economic processes become intelligible. By hastening the collapse of tribalism, economists hope to move rapidly towards the day when they will understand events. Let me ask you all a question. You guys who are listening to my voice right now, let me ask you guys a question. Was it arrogance of the European to just simply think that his way was the way, it was his way or the highway? Or was it intentional that the European looked at the indigenous economies and economies of scale and said, we have to sabotage it? Which one do you think ranked highest? Right? Was it that they really just thought that their shit was greater? And so they just ignored, right? And completely minimized what Africans were already doing? Because let's face it, if you're in an agricultural system, you're going to have an economic system within that agricultural system. It might not look the same as, other systems, but it's a system nonetheless. And we don't have evidence that societies were collapsing because this system was inadequate. So again, I ask the question, was the European just this, complete asshole who disregarded what the Africans were doing because it didn't look like what they were doing? Or was it the case that they fully recognized what it was that the Africans were doing? They recognized its local success, and that if it was having a local success, then what they were bringing in wouldn't be necessary. That what they would be bringing in wouldn't be accepted and it would prevent them from getting a stronger, if at all, a strong foothold in the continent. The revolutionary matron says it was intentional. The middleman is always looking for a payday. All Eurasian theories are used to facilitate their domination and control. Middlemen are hustlers. Thank you for that response, matron. I'll be curious to see those of you who are listening, either live or in the playback. What are your thoughts? Right? Do you think it was intentional? Right? Or do you think it was just arrogant? Right? You guys post your thoughts. I'll read them on air. If you listen to the playback, post your thoughts in the comments, and I'll respond to your comment. We'll have a little dialogue about it. Right? And I ask that question because I tend to think that this white boy is always destroying when he has the opportunity. Right? So that, ergo, his actions are definitely thought out, right? And it's not some oversight on their part. It's definitely deliberate, right? But I do want to play devil's advocate for a second and ask, is it possible that their arrogance is what led them to do what they did when it comes to economics, their economics and philosophies versus the indigenous economics? Right? Why is each of these implicit beliefs likely to be misleading? Well, A, the Western trading example. Of course, this was important. West Africans, like everyone else, are apt to be imitative in their economic behavior. But there were many reasons why the Western examples was much less important than as commonly assumed. And I selected 3 of these for emphasis. 1, other examples are often more important. Thus, it was the North African or Arabian example, as demonstrated in the ancient trans-Saharan trade in gold, ivory, slaves, cola nuts, cloth, etc., which set the pattern for long-distance trade within much of West Africa. We define West Africa for present purposes as bounded by a line of the latitude of northern boundaries of Ghana and Nigeria. Then these trading systems may be denoted as the Northern Muslim example. Principal long-distance traders who linked the northern savannah with the southern forest were the Diola, who operated mainly in Francophone territory, and the Hausa of northern Nigeria, all of them being Muslim. Their example was profound, and many non-Hausa speaking people in the South employ Hausa trading terms. 2, in the field of agricultural production, no Western example existed, there being no common basis of agricultural experience and no contact between the farmer and the expatriate trader, who dealt always with African middlemen. There goes the matron's middlemen. Agriculture, unlike trade, was seldom supported or organized by indigenous political authorities, who drew little, if any, revenue from it. This is not to say that agriculture was, in any useful sense, inefficient, but rather that it was mainly based on local experimentation and local tradition, adapted to soil, climate, crops, and levels of technology. Recent developments, such as the increased migration of farmers and laborers, which followed the introduction of new export crops, have tended to create more geographical uniformity than existed hitherto. But this should not be exaggerated. 3, the expatriate trading firms' strength lay in their ability to adapt themselves to indigenous trading methods, rather than vice versa. Interesting, right? Expatriate trading firms' strength lay in their ability to adapt themselves to indigenous trading methods rather than vice versa. The firms were sophisticated. They learned how to insinuate themselves into the existing trading structure. They were not afraid of credit. But as buyers of export produce, they scarcely ventured inland until after 1900. Thus, the firms which exported Gold Coast cocoa before 1914 knew scarcely anything of the organization of cocoa farming or methods of bush buying, which increasingly fell into the hands of Nigerian middlemen. Of course, the actual exporting function of the expatriate firms was indispensable, of course. In the end, they established networks of buying stations throughout the cocoa area. Though they continued to rely on the Nigerian middlemen for much detailed buying. Indigenous methods of marketing the kola nut, crop which in several ways closely resembles cocoa, owe nothing to the Western expatriate example. They're far more ancient, being based on the northern trading influence. So again, this shows you that these folks had their technology and they adapted their technology to the environment for which they were exploiting. They followed much of the techniques, right, the traditional techniques of the region, but of course they came with mechanizations and stuff like that to create more efficiency, right? But they didn't come in and force something different. You know why they didn't do that? Because they understood that the people there already knew exactly what it was they needed to do. This is why you have to understand the land. You just can't talk about land as freedom. To understand the land and make it do what you want it to do. Make it carry out your wishes. You can still take those methodologies you learn to improve upon in some cases, and in other cases maybe slightly replace some traditional methods that don't serve a good, that don't serve you well in the modern time. But for the most part, you look at what the people there were doing. They understand the environment, right? All you will do is modernize it here and there, right? KW Don 7 says Urugu doesn't like competition. He's answering that previous question. I like that answer, right? These guys intentionally came with their European philosophies, their European philosophies as it relates to economics, and they didn't want the indigenous economics to compete with what they were bringing, right? Urugu doesn't like competition, right? To continue. B, the belief that indigenous economics is too simple for economists. An alternative version of this doctrine is that it is quite permissible for economists to derive conclusions from generalized data, which has a greater validity than more localized material, despite the admitted variations in basic background circumstances. An awful and famous example is provided by Professor P.T. Barr, who insisted in the early 1950s that the various West African cocoa marketing boards had fixed the price to the farmer so far below the world cocoa price that cocoa output was bound to fall catastrophically. Although, as the whole world knows, it has since risen, as one might say, catastrophically. Professor Barr's difficulty resulted not so much from his laissez-faire outlook, which has, as a matter of fact, a considerable relevance in West Africa, as from his implicit assumption that the basic socioeconomic organization of cocoa farming was irrelevant. When one began to study this organization in all its diversity, one was struck by the fact, then recorded in none of the books, that rapid cocoa development usually involves migration of farmers, and by the remarkable long-sightedness of the migrant cocoa farmers who would not stop planting existing lands or making future plans for the planting of newly acquired lands just because the cocoa price seemed low during a run of years, which in any case in the early 50s it did not. A decade is to a cocoa farmer what a year is to Professor Bard. This made nonsense of his generalized statistics, which were somewhat shaky anyway. Furthermore, Professor Bard altogether failed to appreciate the strength of the appeal of the marketing board system of fixed prices for producers, which, though introduced by the British at the beginning of the war, was exceedingly acceptable to West Africans, even though prices fell as a result. The notion of a right price which ideally should remain stable indefinitely, is very common in West Africa. Right? The notion of a quote-unquote right price which ideally should remain stable indefinitely, is very common in West Africa, where economic life is riddled with largely unsuccessful attempts to fix prices on a local or even wider basis, usually by implicit agreement, but even among well-organized traders such as butchers. Machinery for centralized price fixing non-existent. While very short-term price fixing sometimes effectively achieved, prices are never stable in the longer run. They are determined by supply and demand. And institutions which actually lead to the attainment of this ideal are therefore usually welcomed with open arms. Many economists have visited West Africa in advisory capacities since the war. Much of their advice has been very valuable to governments. But convinced as they have been of the simplicity of the indigenous economic organization, few of them, or indeed of the growing band of prominent West African economists, most of them Nigerians, have used their influence to urge the need for more grassroots research. Also, some of the expatriate advisors, especially a few who have visited Ghana, have ventured into pastures much wider than those in which they are accustomed to graze, with somewhat unexpected results. It may be that when Professor W.A. Lewis asserted in a much-read report on industrialization the Gold Coast that agriculture was stagnant, he had an oversimplified image of agricultural organization based on the presumptions that a simple technology necessarily implies simple socioeconomic organization. Inefficiency, some absolute though undefined sense, and small-scale production, though none of these notions are necessarily true or meaningful. Questioning these assumptions as necessary assumptions, making no statement at all about the efficiency of West African agricultural systems. So I would observe that economists are much too prone to make efficiency judgments because they have examined existing mechanisms and alternatives. But I am insistent that an apparently common sense corollary to the stagnant thesis to the effect that industrialization cannot proceed until labor is released from the farms as a result of improved agricultural efficiency imposed from outside happens not to be a corollary. This piece of folklore ignores the special factors which are summed up in the statement that the supply of labor, mostly of savanna origin, is often best regarded as unlimited in quantity. I'm not here referring merely to the magnetic attractive power of industrial employment, but also to the willingness and ability of many West Africans to migrate to rural areas, perhaps sometimes happening to fill the jobs vacated by those who have migrated to the cities. It may well be that up to the present, food farmers have generally organized themselves so as to keep pace with the vastly expanding demand for marketed food, which has resulted from the spectacular increase in West African urbanization. So we see how it may come about that that economic policies based on apparent economic common sense are more damaging than no policy. Brings us to C, the belief that indigenous economics is too complex for economists. It is here that the economists are deserving of everyone's sympathy. Where is the social anthropologist, let alone the economist, who has not heaved a sigh at the appearance of yet another detailed study of quote-unquote all aspects of a small society? And yet, lamentably, there is hardly any non-anthropological, non-statistical material fit for the consumption of economists desirous of acquiring local background. My point is that such material might be useful as well as comprehensible. I'm insisting that if economists would persist with detailed studies in the field, they would soon learn to discern a variety of forms of standard economic behavior amid the diversity. That economic behavior is often more standardized in West Africa than it is in the West. The difficulty is that the diversity and the uniformity required simultaneous emphasis. Thus, taking an actual example, we are the more inclined to insist that most larger cocoa farmers, defined, say, as those with 10 acres of cocoa or more, employ laborers, because we know that there are some farmers who rely solely on family labor and can partially understand why their circumstances are different. As we gain experience, we come to see what kinds of cocoa farmers employ laborers and to associate various types of work with various systems of empowerment. Nor do we need to travel everywhere in the cocoa growing zone before attempting such generalizations, as has been shown by the work of Dr. Marguerite Dupayer among the cocoa farmers of the southwestern Ivory Coast. These and other implicit assumptions have partially accounted for the unwillingness of economists to study the basic fabric of economic life in tropical regions such as West Africa. But there are also many practical difficulties, one of the most disturbing or troublesome being the compartmentalism of indigenous life, which necessitates studying it in terms of individual industries, occupations, sectors, etc., as well as all too often in terms of ethnic groups within these classifications. It is this latter point which tends to break the back of the conventional economist, observing as he must the obsessional interests of the ethno-economists in such matters as occupational specialization in relation to ethnic group. How can he learn to think in terms of 17 or more separate ethnic labor forces, or fail to be displayed by the pursuit of ethnic classificatory questions as ends in themselves? It is this compartmentalism of economic life which partly explains the widespread belief among economists that saving and investment are rare, even as concepts in indigenous economic life. The economist is so unfamiliar with the forms, such saving and investment are apt to take, that he does not know where to look for evidence of their existence. I have heard UN financial experts seriously argue that the admitted unwillingness of individual Ghanaians to buy government securities is evidence of the inability to quote unquote save in any sense of that word. Failure of capital to flow between sectors, as in more developed economies, is partly because many farmers, traders, and other business people have such well-developed, even strict notions of the distinction between capital and spending money, and of the proper usage of the former. Though the migrant cocoa farmers at southern Ghana traditionally invested their savings from cocoa growing and land purchase in the building of houses in the homeland and in the purchase of lorries connected with cocoa and food transport, they were usually concerned with investing capital in other forms of economic activity. It is only by studying indigenous capital formation sector by sector that the possibility of intersectoral flow may come to be properly appreciated. At present, many of the most important forms of fixed capital, such as cocoa farms, are omitted from all official national accounts, mainly because this reflects traditional accounting practice in development countries, but also because some farmers are wrongly presumed to have come into existence almost accidentally, to be acts of God rather than man-made capital assets, creation of which often involve much effort, abstention, and planning. Given this need to study economic life compartmentally, and alas, ploddingly, should the methods of economists and social anthropologists be distinguished? If the investigator is a total anthropologist, then he must understand the necessity of isolating economic factors. He must also be prepared to use every opportunity of hinging the material he collects either to already existing statistics or to other broadly based, administratively organized data, such as farm maps, nominal rolls, etc. Or in the last report, in the absence of existing material, to collect a minimum of simple figures himself. If, however, the investigator is an economist, he should usually discard his traditional procedure of collecting most of this material through field assistance using questionnaires, in favor of a method learned from anthropologists which mainly relies on questioning and observing individuals while they are at work. This is still a preferred methodology, right? Collecting information to field assistance using questionnaires and stuff, still a preferred method, right? Market women should be interviewed in markets, lorry drivers in lorry parks, farmers on their farms or at their houses, fishermen on the beach. Procedure should be semi-statistical, in the sense that similar, even identical questions should be just put to many informants independently with a view to comparing or even totaling their replies. The investigator must adopt an economic point of view, studying the economic organization of companies of beachside fishermen. He may not need to go to sea in a canoe, but it will be essential to witness the selling of fish to women on the beach and to appreciate that the division of labor between man and woman is based on economic good sense, not on mysterious traditional sex rules. It is because he has a point of review that the investigator is able to use a judgment as to what is relevant. So I want to point out something here interesting. These guys are telling you want to study what's going on in the continent. What do you got to do? You got to go to the continent. You have to study there. To talk about the continent, being outside of it, not being on the continent, not being fully immersed on what's going on in the area of the continent, you're trying to settle it. It's foolhardy. It's foolhardy. Right? This is the mistake a lot of us who say we're Pan-Africanists, this is the mistake we're making. We're talking from outside of the continent. There's very little good that will come of it. And I'm sleepy as hell. Very little good that will come of it. The investigator must adopt an economic point of view when studying the economic organization of companies of beach, sea, and fishermen. He may not need to go to the sea in the canoe, but it will be essential to witness the selling of fish to women on the beach and to appreciate that the division of labor between men and women is based on economic good sense, not on mysterious traditional sex roles. It's because he has a point of view that the investigator is able to use his judgment as to what is relevant. Questionnaires, as I have said, must be discarded by the investigator for the simple reason that it is impossible to draw up a satisfactory form until after the research has been completed. The indigenous economist studies the quality of economic life, a statement which may be made respectable to statisticians by adding that he is concerned rather more with identifying the important variables than with measuring their movements. Conventional type of pilot survey is useless, involving as it is with procedural details rather than with fundamentals. As for the use by the economists of the full-blown questionnaire, this in West African conditions is a far more dangerous implement than is commonly realized, one which should only be handled by the surgeon himself. Not only are the welders of questionnaires or wielders of questionnaires often indulging in a kind of anti-intellectual activity, setting out on a voyage of discovery and closing blinkers, but there's also the fact that field assistants have a remarkable capacity to classify recalcitrant material so that it appears to fit neatly into inappropriate boxes, which results in the hardening of prejudices that either that rather require demolition. I hasten to insist that I am not denigrating economic statistics as such. Of course, they are the lifeblood of economics, though our dismal science should scarcely be identifiable with statistics, as are happening increasingly in some African regions, but I am making 4 assertions about them. Firstly, large-scale statistical inquiries, or even inquiries which are basically much dependent on the collective of statistics, are usually best understood by government or other official agencies, which alone command the resources required. Secondly, such large-scale statistics seldom expose the fundamental variables that lie at the grassroots level. Thirdly, it is the duty of social scientists to use such statistics with great discretion in underdeveloped countries, as they are liable to be very misleading. Critical statistics are often assumed to be reliable just because they are official. Specialized UN agencies such as FAO and Economic Commission for Africa are so dependent on these statistics that they feel they must either accept them entirely or pack up. Fourthly, statisticians generally not only expatriate technical experts, usually fail to appreciate the degree of geographical diversity, ecological, economic, and social, which typifies many new underdeveloped countries, including those of the smaller ones which extend from the coast to the northern savanna. Statistical technique of the UN experts responsible for organizing agricultural consensus in West African countries may be impeccable, so far as concerns the choice of the individuals or farms to be counted in any locality. But the local operation is apt to be invalidated by the failure of select sufficient localities for study. Given this great degree of quote-unquote geographical diversity, such agricultural censuses are wished on the poorer countries by the UN and are a monstrous waste of their national effort and manpower resources. The official statistics of the poorer countries are apt to become, in some respects, less accurate, as, partly in response to outside pressure, they become more detailed. The many published reports on the 1960 Ghana population census are monumentally fascinating sources of huge scope, real landmarks of organization and scholarship. Yet some of the statistics are of much worse quality than those collected in previous censuses. And one needs to be an indigenous economist properly to understand this. Certain of the occupational statistics, which appear so accurate because they are so detailed, are very misleading. Traditional prejudices with regard to the relationship between cocoa farmers and their laborers, the latter usually being presumed to do most of the work in the absence of the former, led to a failure to distinguish laborers from farmers, though they are quite distinct categories. Then most of the wholesalers of Ghanaian foodstuffs in southern Ghana are women. Census statistics show them to be nearly all men. Interesting. In general, the process of demolishing the statistical myth with the aid of field research will be a slow one. There's a mystique about official statistics which withstands much battering. All right, this sleep is really messing with me. What we'll do here, take a quick station ID break, and I'll be back on the other side.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
This is D Webb with the Harsh Reality Podcast, asking you to tune in where we tackle the news of the day that affects our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-black perspective, where black problems are addressed with black.
Greetings, fam. Tune in to The Learning Curve with me, the revolutionary matron on KWAZ Radio. Have you ever considered joining KWAZ Radio? Each of our hosts shares their unique perspective with you. You might have a perspective that needs to be shared. If that's true, hit us up at kwaz.radio@gmail.com. What are you gonna do? What you gonna do?
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
What are you going to do? What are you going to do? Thanks to the revolutionary matron for that spot that she created. If you or someone you know thinks that they'll be a perfect fit for this young but growing Black Empowerment, Pan-Africanist podcast network. Have them email kwaz.radio@gmail.com. Let them pitch their idea. Email them with your idea. We are looking for African spirituality. We're looking for a host for debate show, someone who's going to reach out to the different parties, link up a debate, ask questions, moderate the debates, make sure that people don't go over time. And the topics are anything from why didn't the Africans come and save us? Check out my last podcast episode. If the episodes are, if you want to discuss, dating, conscious dating. I have this idea. I just don't want to be responsible for doing that show, but I have an idea for a conscious dating show. So we're looking for those types to join. And of course, we're also looking for the guys who can speak to economics, can speak to agriculture, etc. Just have them email kwaz.radio@gmail.com, pitch their idea so that we can work out with them. All right, let's finish this paper before I fall asleep live on the air. This is what happens when you don't sleep. Should have gone to bed and the learning curve with the matron after dark finished. Morning, I continued reading some Garveyism and haven't slept all night, so now I'm paying for it. Let's continue. I have suggested a number of reasons why, as it were, traditionally economists have neglected the study of indigenous economics in West Africa. Nowadays, there is another general and most powerful resistance at work. The whole ideology of those who count themselves underdevelopment specialists is nearly always actively proposed to indigenous studies. Theoreticians, econometricians, and planners all share a common philosophy of ideological optimism based on the past success in solving certain economic problems, particularly that of mass unemployment in some historical countries, some industrial countries. Critical acceptance of conventional types of official statistics is one consequence of this optimism. While economists know in their hearts that most West African food production figures are guesses, even wild guesses, that's crazy. They hardly ever admit this when quoting and comparing the figures. The idea being, presumably, that some figures are always better than no figures. Theoreticians do not seem to revolutionize their model building by drawing new ideas from anthropologically oriented material. The econometricians are so much concerned with manipulation, with manipulation, that series, that they hardly consider the reliability of the statistical data in terms of the humdrum problems of its basic collection in the field. Planners and advisors regard themselves as economic doctors with the duty of making quick diagnoses and judgments on the basis of inadequate knowledge. Philosophy of optimism would be more justifiable were there more evidence that the economists had met with market success in solving the economic problems of the poorer countries. Now they are in a hurry because they have given no thought to such problems. Was not the very word underdevelopment coined little more than 20 years ago? Until the underprivileged expressing themselves politically left them no choice. It is the politicians and people of the poorer countries who see their salvation in development. who demand assistance from the richer and the better educated. Although economists do their best to keep up with this demand, and although their advice is often ignored, part of the responsibility for the ever-widening gap between the living standards of rich and poor countries is surely theirs. And is there not a sense in which development proceeds despite the economists? You've got to develop. The future role of the indigenous economist will be a modest one. He will pursue his subject partly for his own sake and partly in the hope that in the longer run, he may help to create a more realistic climate of economic thought, especially about rural activities, which will continue to engage most West Africans for many years to come. The present-day planner has no time to read our obscure sources, and we may even sympathize with him when he regards our material as obsolescent. Oh, really? Or as an impediment to the ideal in which he is playing. Someone, and I don't know who this should be, should set about digesting our material in a way which would give it some comprehensibility and appeal to those who do not sympathize with our methods and aims. So will you take up the call? Those of you listening? The situation is educationally urgent. On the one hand, there are no respectable textbooks of applied economics appropriate to West African conditions. One certainly need not beg the question of whether basically rural societies, lacking a capitalist land-owning class, may become fully socialist without first passing through an industrial stage. Before insisting that Marxist textbooks are no more relevant than the capitalist variety. On the other hand, sufficient generalized nonsense is written about African economic conditions, especially by British and American academics, to ensure the hardening of prevailing economic myths. One of the most fashionable myths is that shifting cultivation is bad. Without defining terms and without considering the possible efficiency of alternative cultivation systems, economists both condemn shifting cultivation out of hand and regarded as unusual in sub-Saharan Africa. Interesting. In point of fact, in West Africa, shifting cultivation, properly regarded, is far less common than our systems of recurrent cultivation, which commonly involve individual farmers returning to cultivate their portions of land after the restoration of fertility through fallow, whereas the term shifting cultivation implies a ramshackle, wasteful, obsolete state of affairs. Systems of recurrent cultivation, if understood, could often be represented as respectable, even scientific. They usually, of course, involve crop rotation. Even with systems of continuous cultivation, which are much commoner in West Africa than is generally realized, it is injustifiable to assume, as most economists do, that the Malthusian brink is necessarily nearby, if only because such systems are compatible with the simultaneous existence of unused or partially cultivated land. However, if the degree of pressure on the land does happen to justify Malthusian despair, the means by which the local population attempts to alleviate the situation, refusing to die off, are often well worthy of study, especially as many population density maps are surprisingly patchy, so that short distance migration of farmers often presents possibilities. So tied up with Malthusianism are the presumed dangers of fragmentation. Let me just tune into the chat room and see if anything is happening. Ogun is here saying peace, family. Y'all say peace to Ogun. Let Ogun know that he is welcome here. Let Ogun know that it's nice to see him here. Ogun has become a regular panelist on the Matron's show, The Learning Curve, and especially the Matron After Dark show. You guys want to tune in, check out Ogun and his contributions. Check out Kevin Carre and his contributions. Check out Magi Commander and Mr. Untouchable for their contributions, as well as Erzuliism, who you know from the chat room here. All right? Make sure to tune in to the Learning Curve with the Revolutionary Matron. Make sure to tune in to the Matron After Dark. Most West African farmers in the forest zone, and perhaps also in the savannah, produce much of the food they require for their own consumption. So that's what I like to hear. Most West African farmers in the forest zone, and perhaps also in the savannah, produce much of the food they require for their own consumption. They are subsistence producers, right? They only produce what's necessary, right? But subsistence does not necessarily imply inefficiency, as economists usually assume. There are many reasons why this may be so, and I select the following for mention. A, multi-cropping, the growing of two or more crops simultaneously on the same land, makes such good agronomic sense in West Africa that specialization on one crop is seldom desirable. B, cocoyam and plantain are necessary cover crops for young cocoa seedlings, so that cocoa farmers with new farms cannot avoid producing these foodstuffs. C, labor, rather than land, is often the scarce factor. Labor, rather than land, is a scarce factor. That's interesting. So that to get the maximum output, farmers must distribute the available manpower between crops with different growing cycles. D, it is sometimes cheaper to grow food, if need to be with hired labor rather than to buy it. Considering the great bulkiness of certain staple West African foodstuffs, especially cassava and plantain, E, it is often economic for laborers who are primarily employed in connection with the production of a cash crop to produce subsistence crops, right? Both for themselves and their masters. F, given existing technology, there are few obvious advantages in fully large-scale production of any crop, nor need there be with mechanization, where tractor hiring services more often available to the private factor. So the private farmer. Man, I'm really struggling. The problem for economists is that of the right balance, the different circumstances between subsistence and cash production. The general responsiveness of farmers to the growing demand for marketed food not being in doubt. Of course, there are many economists who are well aware that economic circumstances in underdeveloped countries are different. One of them being Mr. W.B. Redaway, whose experience in India led him to emphasize the need for economists to adopt new sets of instructions, assumptions in underdeveloped countries. But how should the advisory economists set about acquiring such assumptions, given that the civil servant, on whom presumably he mainly depends for information, are those most proficient in soaking up and relaying prevailing economic folklore much of it Western in origin. Might not the indigenous economist help? The indigenous economist is bound to remain a laughingstock with governments and mainstream economists alike. As he is not primarily interested in modernization, he will appear to be an intellectual, if not a political conservative, and perhaps it is impossible to study existing institutions nonetheless. With a part of one's mind, one wishes to preserve them, at least for the length of time required for their study. So the division of labor must continue to be the rule among economists. But we do ask the planner with whom, so far as we are all concerned, all power lies, to agree that a partial return to the web tradition of socioeconomic observation on crying issues would be a forward, not a backward step. And that's the paper. Forgive me if I read slowly at times, if I slurred my words, but like I said, I'm working off no sleep. Right? You guys in the chat, let me know with a 1 if you like the paper, if it's giving you some ideas, some insight, or type 2 if it doesn't, if the paper didn't really resonate well with you. Right? Type 1 if it resonated with you, gave you some ideas, some understanding, made you think that this is something we need to look into a little bit further, like need to look a little bit closer at the practice of these agricultural economics in Western Africa. Or press 2 if it, didn't resonate with you at all. Right? One last reminder that this show is part of a podcast network, and I'm inviting you to tune into all of the other shows on the network, subscribe to their YouTube channels, help them become monetized through your subscription numbers and through your watch hours. Click the bell to be notified when they're on live or when they're uploading new content, right? And share episodes that you find particularly interesting, particularly worthy of discussion amongst you and your peers. Just a reminder of what the shows are on the podcast network.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
This is D Webb with the Harsh Reality Podcast, asking you to tune in where we tackle the news of the day that affects our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-black perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
Greetings, fam. Tune in to The Learning Curve with me, the revolutionary matron on KWAZ Radio.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Yes, indeed. Make sure to check out all those shows. I will be back on Saturday. Saturday, we're going to do the Saturday night Shoot the Breeze. You join the Discord, the link is in the description of the episode. It's also pinned to the top of the chat. You join the Discord, locate Shoot the Breeze channel, and you can post topics that you'd like us to shoot the breeze about. If you're not familiar with Shoot the Breeze is where we come together on a Saturday night, 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And we discuss prompts that were posted by you, the listeners, on the Discord. And you, the listeners, can also jump on the Discord and speak your piece as to your understanding and your thoughts on these various prompts. We have quite a few prompts this week, but you can definitely still add to the prompts that are there. If we don't get to your prompt in a particular week, we'll definitely do it the following week. Right? But this is your chance to interact with the whole family. Right? Not just me, but to interact with everyone, to share insights, etc. Right? So tune in to, it's usually a fun time. Usually a good time, insightful. Tune in this Saturday at 8 p.m. for the Saturday Night Shoot the Breeze. I want to go through now and thank everyone who was here tonight. Just a few of you were here live, but I appreciate all of you, even if it was just one of you. In fact, if it was none of you, I will still appreciate you because I know that you support the channel. You support the show and you tune in to the episodes either live or on playback. Okay, so KW Don 7, who also typed 1, meaning that he appreciated the paper. He probably got some ideas of something to look into a little deeper. You know, like I suggested, let's look into the actual practice. What is the practice of this economics and this agricultural economy look like in West Africa? Right? It's something that we should resonate with pretty well for historical and genetic memory reasons. Right? So it's something to look into. I'm going to look into it a little further, and perhaps we can read about it on the show. The learning curve with the revolutionary matron was here. Of course, she typed 1 as well. Ogun was here. He said peace family earlier. Right? Tito District was here. Appreciate you, Tito District, for coming through. Earlier, we had NYC Beauties here, saying hello to the room. NYC Sports Archives was here saying greetings. And Kevin Carre 42 was here greeting the whole family. He was ready for this discussion. Without further ado, guys, you guys be good. I'll see you on Saturday. Thank you again for stopping by.
Thanks for listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast with your host, Koku. If you like what you just heard, we hope you pass along our web address, bittermedicineblogs.com, to your friends and colleagues, and share our show to all your social media. Be sure to check out our archive section on our website for previous podcasts. This has been a KWAZ radio production. Join us next time for another session of the Bitter Medicine Podcast. Follow us on Facebook at Bitter Medicine Show, Twitter, Bitter Meds, Tumblr, Bitter Meds, Instagram, Bitter Medicine.